Come this June, it will have been 10 years ago now that I first set eyes on our beloved Storrs, Connecticut. Armed with a printed map of Mansfield and other surrounding towns that the pastoral search committee of our congregation had included in a whole box full of brochures and other information about our local area that they'd mailed me in advance. Armed with that map, I set forth from Bradley Airport in a rental car and trekked out here to these eastern highlands to meet up with Dave Jordan and Robin Blomstrand for lunch, as what was the opening of the first of two in-person interview trips that ultimately, of course, led to my coming before you as the candidate to be your next pastor. Luckily for me that day, I was running a little bit ahead of schedule, because that initial trip out here to Storrs was not without a bit of adventure. You see, that print map of the town, which I was following to guide my path out here, it doesn't quite tell you everything you might wish you had known about the various routes through the area. Namely, it did not tell me that as I was heading east on Route 44 that perhaps it was not the best of ideas to turn south onto 32 in order to connect up with a seemingly direct-looking path toward campus known as Ravine Road. I say path toward campus. For any of you who are not familiar, Ravine Road, just a couple miles to the west of us where we are right now, is not much more than a glorified cow path, an unpaved dirt road narrowly winding its way around the edge of a ravine. Now by this point in the trip, I was already a little bit worried about just what it was I was getting myself into coming out here, as I earlier had passed those big dairy farms from Farmer's Cow along 44 in Coventry that reminded me far too much of the small farm town environs of my childhood, which I had not intended to return to. Already with that unease, winding that rental car across the rutted, partially washed out tracks of Ravine Road did not make things any better. And when my erroneous reading of that map led me, as I got up to the corner with North Eagleville, to turn right instead of left and thus be taken right back out to Route 32, well, let's just say we're all lucky that it was that very same map that helped me find my way back to the more major roads I probably should have stuck to in the first place. As an aside, some of you know the irony of this story, namely that by December of that same year, I'd be moving into a rented house on that very same Ravine Road, and it served as home for me for the first 2 years I was here. There's an old saying that says, if you don't know where you are going, any road will do. It's a saying that's a bit of a paraphrase from a scene in Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and it's been paraphrased by many others since then. Now, of course, in one way, as I came out here for that first interview with our search committee, I did know where I was supposed to be going. But in another sense, my travails onto Ravine Road make for a good metaphor for ministry and for life in general. None of us truly know where the highways and byways of life will take us. The joys, the challenges, the relationships, the places of frustration and of deep meaning that will await us. Nevertheless, just as that map helped me get back on course toward what has become this journey together over more than 9 years now, there's something deeply important about knowing where we are headed, our ultimate goal and destination. And that's why, my friends, I do not think it is too much to argue that the portion of the Lord's Prayer that is our focus for today may very well be the most important petition in the whole thing. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. As I've said, through this whole season of Lent, we're taking time to journey through the 6 sections of the Lord's Prayer, that familiar prayer that Jesus offered to his disciples when they asked him, Lord, teach us to pray. And as I said last week, this prayer that Jesus taught, it unifies us as Christians across all of our divisions and differences. Protestants and Catholics, conservatives and liberals, liturgical and free church worshipers, we all follow Jesus' instruction to, quote, pray then in this way. In that way, this prayer serves almost like a bit of a creed in a way, a symbol and a summary of the common shared faith around which we gather as we come together in Christian community. The power of prayer, and I mentioned this last week in passing, the power of prayer isn't even so much about how or even whether it changes God, but how it changes us, and in changing us, changes our world. Both changes the world around us, but also changes the world in which we live in our own minds and spirits. Part of the way prayer changes us, especially the Lord's Prayer, has to do with the ways that our prayers both shape and testify to that which we truly believe, and moreover, that for which we truly yearn. As one United Methodist pastor has put it, prayer is not about telling God something God does not know. It's not about persuading God or changing God's mind. It's certainly not about convincing God to love us and so do what we want God to do. Prayer is primarily confessing all that God has already done in our lives. Prayer as confession is therefore an act of worship, for it is a celebration of God's goodness toward us. This petition with which Jesus leads off the prayer, the very first thing he says and instructs after he's gotten through the sort of addressing of God, it stands as a profound confession of how we understand the world, how we understand ourselves, how we understand God. Praying, your kingdom come, your will be done. In doing so, we recognize a deep truth about our world, namely that the world in which we live does not yet embody God's true desire for it. The ways in which this world operates are not, at least not yet and not fully, they're not the ways in which God would have the world be. I love the story that we heard this morning from the book of 1 Samuel for precisely this reason. It's a delightful little mirroring of how we so often as humans manage to shoot ourselves in the foot, so to speak, even in the face of wise advice to the contrary. In case you missed it, basically what happens is that the Israelite people, having come out of the slavery in Egypt and wandered in the wilderness and now settled back down in their supposed promised land, they ask, or even demand, you might say, that Samuel, one of the chief priests and leaders of their people, they demand that Samuel give them a king, so that we may be like other nations, they say. Samuel comes back after having talked to God about this and says to them, you know, folks, you don't really want that. A king is going to steal all your wealth for himself and is going to lead all your children off to their deaths. And so what do the people say in response to this? No, we are determined to have a king. Well, I guess you can't say that they weren't warned. How often do any of us Whether we're talking about our personal lives or the life of our community, the lives of our nations around this world, how often do we end up doing pretty much the very same thing, from our personal habits to our voting choices to our economic realities of this world? But you see, praying, "Your kingdom come," doesn't just indicate to us a reality about the brokenness of our world. It also invites us to imagine a different world. The world as God meant it to be and will ultimately make it. Praying, "Your kingdom come, your will be done," is staking out that pin on that map that says this is where we're headed. It points us to the destination for which ultimately God has created us and all the world, a destination that we shall find our way to. It pushes us to that holy dissatisfaction with the brokenness all around us, and yet it pushes us to that hope that something else is possible. That yes, we may be driving down the rutted and washed out cow paths of our lives, but there is somewhere else to which we are headed. We do not pray, "Your kingdom come," without actually holding on to some dream, some hope, some trust that in fact something different than what we now know is not only possible, but somehow, at some time, in some way, will actually be birthed among us. And not just in some ethereal heaven, but on earth, in our lives. The reality is, of course, we still await that day on one hand. And yet, on the other hand, we live in a world in which the kingdom of heaven is always breaking in little glimpses, little sparks, little signs that that let us know that indeed the destination is still out there and we will reach it someday. For those with eyes to see and ears to hear, the glimpses of God's reign are there for the taking. A man known to us simply by his first initial S writes, "As a child, I frequently watched my mother prepare dinner. I would stand on tiptoe at her side, eyes at the counter's edge, and watch her work on the cutting board. It wasn't long before she invited me to help. I started with simple tasks like fetching the ingredients from the fridge and the cupboard. Under her direction, I learned to read a measuring cup. She taught me the fundamentals of cooking in the oven, in the slow cooker, in the skillet. I remember stirring everything with wooden spoons. The food ready, we'd sit down to eat at a perfectly set table with plates on top of placemats, glasses filled with water and ice, knives, forks, and spoons laid over napkins. When I had a family of my own, I followed my mother's example. I found that I enjoyed cooking for others. There's something about watching people take their first bite of a dish that I have prepared, the way their eyes shut and they sigh and they smile. These days, I mostly cook for myself because I am in prison. I have to measure everything by eye. My ingredients are pulled from a locker and cooked in a microwave. No glasses, no silverware. If I invite guests, they show up with their own plastic bowl, spork, and cup. The space quickly grows crowded, a few men on the bed, one on the locker, another on the toilet. In a room smaller than most bathrooms, 5 men sit elbow to elbow, mouths full, and nodding in approval. When I first came to prison, I felt that the tradition of sharing a meal had disappeared from my life. But I found it again. The kingdom breaks in glimpses, in sparks, in quiet echoes that nevertheless manage to break through the noisy cacophony of our lives. Let us grab onto those glimpses and be inspired by them to pray with our most earnest and heartfelt yearnings. Your kingdom, O God, come. Your will, O God, be done.